Currently, Troy Aikman is referred to as a completely closed chapter in American football history, the legendary quarterback of the Dallas Cowboys, three-time Super Bowl champion, Super Bowl MVP, Hall of Fame member, and even after leaving the field, he continues to appear every week on national television as a definitive voice of the NFL. In the collective memory of American fans, Aikman represents the image of absolute stability, the leader who never panics, never acts impulsively, never needs to show off to assert his authority. He embodies the textbook quarterback controlling the game, controlling his teammates, controlling his emotions, and completing the mission in the most intense pressure moments without showing any sign of wavering. The trophies, the historic games, the Hall of Fame ceremonies, and his successful broadcasting career after retirement have created a perfect portrait, a man who wins at every stage, walking through time as if carrying no trace of violent sacrifice or loss. On the surface, Troy Aikman is a living testament to the American dream in sports: do things the right way, take responsibility, maintain discipline, and then be rewarded by history with lasting respect. But it is precisely this completeness that makes his story dangerous, because it is too clean, too neat, as if 30 years of collisions at the most brutal level of professional sports could pass without leaving any consequences on the human being inside that uniform. Behind that celebrated image is another Troy Aikman, living in parallel but almost invisible, a man who had to learn to endure in silence, because weakness was never considered a valid option. Throughout his career, he didn't just face opponents on the field, he also faced his own body gradually rebelling, with concussions treated as routine, with memory gaps that no one ever asked him to explain. Troy's willpower didn't lie in the fact that he felt no pain, but in the fact that he never allowed the pain to come into the light. When the helmet came off and the cheers faded, he still had to continue existing as a flawless icon, even though inside was a man quietly paying the price with his memory, with accumulated fatigue, with the loneliness of someone who always had to appear fine. Troy Aikman lived two lives, not by choice, but by circumstance. One life that the world saw and praised, and the other life where he had to bear all the consequences of greatness alone. This is not a story of a hidden collapse, but a story of the willpower of a man who stood firm for 30 years, not because he was unhurt, but because he never allowed himself to fall. If you want to continue following the stories behind sports icons, where glory does not hide the price human beings have to pay, please subscribe to the channel and join us on this journey. Troy Aikman's childhood was not marked by dramatic events or extreme poverty, but it was shaped by a framework even harsher in a quiet way: absolute discipline, and the belief that a child's value lies in the achievements he produces. The Aikman family was middle class, never lacking material needs, but also never abundant in comfort or affection. In that house, everything operated on clear principles: do well, and you're recognized; do not well enough, and you must try harder, while emotions were not something to be dissected or shared. Troy grew up in an environment where no one asked "Are you okay?" but only observed whether you completed your task or not. The practices, the youth games, the quiet expectations from the adults around him gradually taught the boy an important lesson: weakness brings no benefit, and complaining only makes you appear smaller in others' eyes. When Troy fell, no one scolded him harshly, but no one stopped long enough to ask if he was in pain either. That silence, repeated over and over, became the only language Troy learned to communicate with the world. In that family, failure was not publicly punished, but it was also not explained or embraced. It was simply a signal that he needed to be stronger, faster, more precise next time. Gradually, Troy understood that to survive and be accepted, he had to handle every wound himself, from physical scrapes to the feeling of disappointment when expectations weren't met. Emotions, if they existed, had to be swallowed quickly, because no one had time to listen to a boy talk about his fears or confusion. It was in that context that Troy formed a very early survival mechanism, controlling himself to the point of revealing no fluctuation whatsoever, learning to stand tall even when inside he hadn't yet processed what was happening. Football came to him not just as a sport, but as a clear system of order, where everything had rules, roles, and specific rights and wrongs, a world far easier to understand than the vague emotions he was never taught to name. Every time he stepped onto the field, Troy knew exactly what he had to do. Every time he was hit, he knew he had to get up, and every time he felt pain, he knew silence was the safest choice. No one directly told Troy he couldn't cry for help, but the entire environment around him made him understand that crying for help was unnecessary, even inappropriate. And so that boy grew up with a quiet but persistent belief: if I endure well enough, if I don't bother anyone with my weaknesses, then everything will be fine. But what Troy didn't know at the time was that every time he swallowed a wound, he was also depriving himself of the ability to be comforted, to share, and to be recognized as a fragile human being. That childhood left behind no easily told tragic memories, but it left a far more dangerous legacy: a child who didn't know how to ask for help, not because he was too strong, but because he was never taught that asking for help was allowed. And it was from that foundation of silence that the later Troy Aikman was built, a man who could stand firm before tens of thousands of eyes, yet didn't know what to say when left alone with his own wounds. Stepping out of a childhood where weakness had no place, Troy Aikman found in American football a strange space where what was once considered injury was redefined as praiseworthy quality. On the field, pain was no longer a sign of fragility, but proof of commitment. Bruises no longer needed protection, but became invisible medals, and silence, instead of being misunderstood as avoidance, was celebrated as courage. Football gave Troy a new language for survival: endure, get up, and absolutely never let emotions interfere with the task. In that harsh structure, the quarterback position was placed at the center of all pressure: the one who reads the game, directs the rhythm, bears responsibility for every mistake, and is also the first to face judgment when things fall apart. For Troy, this role felt like a preordained choice. He didn't need to learn how to talk about emotions, because football had taught him how to transform everything into commands and action. When a hit left him dazed, the unwritten law of the field answered for him: if you can still stand, keep going. When a blow numbed his arm, the scoreboard and teammates' eyes reminded him that responsibility remained. There, performance became the perfect cover. Every accurate pass covered a pain that hadn't yet been named. Every victory blurred a long night of aching body and empty mind. In that way, football legitimized pain, not by denying it, but by turning it into the condition for being accepted. Troy quickly learned the survival loop of the sport: pain endures silence, pain is unavoidable, enduring is the leader's duty, silence is the price to remain trusted. Every time he steadied the huddle under pressure, every time he rose after a heavy hit, that loop was reinforced, became habit, then became identity. Teammates saw a calm leader, coaches saw a cold mind, fans saw a steady hero. Few noticed that this very steadiness was built on suppressing warning signals from body and emotion. In a culture that worships toughness, Troy was rewarded for his ability to not express, and therefore had even less reason to change. The long training days, the packed game schedules, the repeated collisions over the years gradually etched in a dangerous belief: if I keep completing the mission, all injuries can be postponed. The quarterback didn't just carry tactical responsibility, but symbolic responsibility too. He had to be the last one to waver, the one not allowed to show fear, the one who turns pressure into order. Troy accepted that role like accepting a natural law, because it gave him the sense of control his childhood had lacked. On the field, everything had order, every signal had meaning, every decision had clear consequences. Inside, emotions were pushed aside, waiting until the job is done, a moment that was never scheduled. And so the loop of pain endures silence didn't just operate in the four quarters, but seeped into everyday life, where Troy continued to behave like a quarterback even without the helmet. He learned to suppress the fatigue, the fleeting dazes, the moments of being off rhythm that no one saw. Success kept coming, reinforcing the belief that the method was right, while the personal injuries, having been covered for too long, gradually lost their right to be acknowledged. Football gave Troy a path to shine, but at the same time locked the door to asking for help. In that world, enduring is morality, silence is honor, and standing firm, no matter how high the price becomes each season, is seen as the only choice for a leader. It was here, where pain is celebrated and legitimized, that the man Troy Aikman began to be completed, not as someone who doesn't know pain, but as someone who learned to turn pain into something that doesn't need to be spoken, beginning a long journey where victory always comes first, while the consequences quietly follow behind. Leaving Oklahoma was not an impulsive or rebellious decision, but the first moment Troy Aikman learned to put cold calculation above belief, a survival choice made in silence, with no explanation, no search for sympathy. In Oklahoma, Troy had a place, familiarity, a sense of belonging, but it was there that he realized his limits were not in effort or discipline, but in circumstances and structure, things that didn't care about the emotions of a young man trying to become the best version of himself. When injury struck and his role was shaken, Troy didn't react with anger or self-pity. He read the situation like reading a playbook, then drew the cold conclusion: if he wanted to continue surviving at the highest level, he had to leave, not because he stopped believing in Oklahoma, but because he believed emotions couldn't guarantee the future. The decision to transfer to UCLA therefore carried the appearance of a strategic retreat, rather than a journey in search of a dream. It was an acknowledgement that in this brutally competitive world, loyalty to feelings could become a fatal weakness. Troy didn't talk much about regret, because he was already accustomed to swallowing every fluctuation. He packed it away with what was unnecessary, and walked on carrying a new belief that was harder, but also lonelier. Choose the place that allows you to keep living, even if the price is leaving behind what once made you feel safe. At UCLA, everything was unfamiliar, from the sunny windy coast to the pressure to prove himself once again, but that very unfamiliarity suited the survival instinct forming in Troy. He adapted quickly, trained like it was a duty, learned the new system with the precision of someone who understood time was not on his side. Every practice, every game was a reminder that the road ahead had no room for hesitation, and in that process, Troy continued to cut away the remaining soft pieces, the what-ifs, the feelings of regret, the desires to stay because of sentiment. He learned to treat every decision like a calculation, where the only acceptable variable was the ability to survive long-term at the top. Success began to return, not loudly but steadily, reinforcing the belief that the cold choice was the right choice. Yet every time a door opened because of that precision, another door closed inside him, the door leading to emotional connection with himself. Troy no longer asked what he wanted, but only what needed to be done to not be left behind. And when that second question became the only guiding principle, the distance between the outer man and the inner man began to widen. He became more efficient, more reliable, and also more estranged from the vibrations that make up inner life. Those around him saw a mature, composed quarterback who knew how to make decisions. Few realized that behind that composure was a continuous chain of choices, each demanding he sacrifice another piece of his capacity to be vulnerable. Leaving Oklahoma was therefore not just a career turning point, but a major psychological milestone, the first time Troy proved to himself that he could cut off sentiment to protect his future. And from that moment, a new rule was established in his life: the more successful he became, the farther he moved from himself, the closer he got to the peak, the less he turned back to ask how he was feeling. That decision helped Troy keep moving forward, but at the same time it laid the foundation for a life where emotions were always placed after the mission, where survival was prioritized over inner wholeness. In the light of those new advances, the price had not yet surfaced. It waited patiently, accumulating in every cold choice, until one day it would become an inseparable part of the man Troy Aikman would carry for the rest of his life. The NFL Draft 1989 did not open before Troy Aikman like a ceremony of honor, but like a heavy door leading straight into the land of absolute expectation, where every mistake was magnified and every failure came at the cost of the body. When his name was called as the #1 pick, that moment carried no sigh of relief, but an unspoken curse: he was not allowed to fail. The Dallas Cowboys at that time were not a symbol of victory. They were a crumbling empire, a team searching for a miracle to escape a glorious past that had faded. And that miracle was placed on the shoulders of a young quarterback who had just left UCLA with a resume convincing enough to be the first pick, but not thick enough to shield him from the storm that was coming. Troy stepped into the Cowboys' locker room with the clear awareness that this was not a place to learn the ropes, this was a place to carry the load, to fix things, to take responsibility for what he hadn't caused. From day one, every eye was on him, not to support, but to measure, was he tough enough to endure? In an organization under reconstruction, patience was a luxury, every loss was an accusation, every bad throw a question about the decision to pick him number one. Troy understood that faster than anyone, because his entire childhood and the years before had taught him one single lesson in harsh systems: only results are heard. So he threw himself into the work with a coldness that had become instinct, learned the playbook like a survival map, trained with the intensity of someone with no right to fatigue, and took the field with the mindset of someone who knew he stood at the front line of all criticism. The Cowboys lost more than they won in those early seasons, and each defeat tightened the noose around his neck a little more, but the most dangerous thing was not the numbers on the scoreboard, but the way Troy began to treat his body like a tool that could be sacrificed to keep the team standing. The hits came faster, harder, and more frequently. Every time he was knocked down, he got up like a reflex, because the number one pick was not allowed to show fragility. In the NFL, especially on a crumbling team, the quarterback was not just the play caller but the first shield against all instability, and Troy accepted that role with calm resignation, as if it were the obvious price of the position he held. No one said outright that he had to pay with his body, but every signal around him pointed in one direction: if he wanted to keep leadership, if he wanted to protect the fragile trust of teammates and coaches, he had to endure more than others. The hits that drew no blood, the moments of dizziness swallowed with a breath, the nights when his body ached, but his mind still had to return to the meeting room to watch film, all of it became normal rhythm. Troy didn't resist, because resistance meant admitting limits, and the number one pick had no right to admit limits. In the public eye, he was the symbol of new hope. In reality, he was learning to live with pressure that had no escape, where every wrong decision brought physical punishment, where resilience was measured by the ability to keep getting up even as the inside felt like it was cracking. The curse of expectation didn't reveal itself through boos, but through the heavy silence after every loss, through the expectant looks waiting for something extraordinary from a man still trying to perfect himself. Troy responded by tightening his self-discipline even more, narrowing the space for emotion further, and treating pain like a debt to be paid to buy time for his career. From that moment, the loop was locked tight. Pressure creates mistakes, mistakes demand atonement with the body, and the body becomes the storage place for every consequence. The NFL Draft 1989 didn't just give Troy Aikman a career, it started a journey where he was forced to learn how to survive in blinding lights without ever being allowed to fall, where every step forward was paid for with flesh, and where the curse of the number one pick quietly followed him through every season, reminding him that at the top, mercy does not exist. The first hits that Troy Aikman had to take in those early NFL seasons didn't draw blood, didn't create visible wounds, but they opened up a far deeper tragedy, where the body began to rebel in the quietest and most dangerous way. The first concussion arrived without any warning bell. It was just a fleeting moment of dizziness, a feeling like the ground tilted slightly, the stadium lights suddenly too bright, and the sounds around him echoing back slower than normal. Troy got up, shook his head a few times, took a deep breath, and went back to the huddle as if nothing had happened, because in the world he was living in, those signs were never considered a legitimate reason to leave the field. The NFL culture at that time didn't ask players how they felt, it only observed whether they could still stand, and if they could still stand, if they could still read the play, if they could still throw the ball in the right direction, then the mission continued. Troy quickly learned that dizziness wasn't an injury, but a state to be pushed through. Disorientation wasn't a signal to stop, but something to be hidden so as not to shake the team's confidence. He kept playing, not because he didn't recognize what was happening, but because the entire system around him made stopping a more dangerous choice. Every time he left the field for health reasons, the first question wasn't whether he was safe, but how the team would manage without him. The responsibility of the quarterback, especially a number one pick, didn't allow hesitation, And so Troy learned to self-adjust, self-assess, self-determine when he was fine, a definition that drifted further and further from biological reality. The next hits came faster and harder, because the Cowboys were still in rebuilding mode, the offensive line not yet solid enough to protect him from relentless rushes. Every collapse on the field was another shock to the nervous system, and every time he got up was another reinforcement of the belief that he could live with it. He learned to distinguish mild dazes from concerning ones, not to protect himself, but to decide whether he could keep playing without causing problems for the team. The culture of if you can still stand, you have to go back out there, didn't need to be spoken aloud. It soaked into every glance, every nod from the coach, every round of applause from the crowd, whenever he rose after a heavy hit. Troy wasn't taught how to rest when his brain was injured, he was taught how to conquer that injury with willpower. And in this case, willpower became a double-edged sword. It allowed him to keep leading, to keep completing the mission, but at the same time it forced him to ignore the increasingly clear warning signals from his own body. There were games where Troy didn't fully remember the quarters that had just happened, moments where he had to rely on post-game film to piece together his memory, but those details were kept private, because admitting them meant putting a question mark over his leadership ability. In an environment where toughness was celebrated, saying that your head wasn't right was seen as self-sabotage of your position. So Troy chose silence, chose to keep taking the field, chose to turn the hits that drew no blood into an inevitable part of the job. He didn't see himself as a victim, nor did he allow himself to think about a distant future. Everything was narrowed down to the present, to the task at hand, to leading the team through each drive. But every time he accepted another hit, every time he played on without full recovery, the price increased a little more, quietly accumulating in his brain. Troy learned to live with brain injury the way one learns to live with bad weather, uncontrollable, only adaptable. He adjusted habits, adjusted preparation, adjusted his rhythm of life to minimize consequences that were never properly named. Headaches, unusual fatigue, memory gaps were treated as insignificant side effects of the profession. The NFL culture back then had no language for invisible injuries, and therefore Troy had no language to describe what he was going through. He only knew that if he kept standing firm, kept fulfilling the quarterback role, then everything would be considered fine. The tragedy lay in the fact that his very ability to stand firm became evidence against him, allowing the brain injuries to continue being ignored. The hits that drew no blood taught Troy a cruel lesson in this world. Pain only has value when it's obvious enough to disrupt work. If it can be hidden, then it's required to be hidden. And so amid the applause for his resilience, Troy Aikman stepped deeper into a path where his body had to bear the consequences of a culture that glorified endurance, opening up a bodily tragedy that would follow him for the rest of his life, even though it left not a single drop of blood on the field. After the hits that drew no blood, Troy Aikman entered a phase where his leadership role was no longer a learned skill, but a burden he had to carry every day, every game, every breath. Troy didn't yell in the locker room, didn't slam his helmet to the floor for effect, didn't need fiery speeches to fire up the team. His leadership was present in the way he stood at the center of the huddle with a steady voice, in the way he called plays decisively, while teammates were still wavering, in the way he stepped up to the line of scrimmage with calm eyes even when his body was rebelling. Teammates saw in Troy a stable anchor, someone whose mere presence was enough to slow the entire team's heart rate. They believed that as long as Troy was standing there, everything still had order, still had a way out. And that very belief, beautiful but harsh, began to weigh on him in a way no one else could carry for him. To keep the collective from falling into panic, Troy had to hide the signs of his own cracking, had to turn pain into background noise, had to learn to lead while he himself needed guidance. Every game, every drive, he carried not just the playbook, but the responsibility of protecting the spirit of the other 10 men on the field, and to do that he accepted pushing his personal limits further and further back. When his mind blurred for a moment after a hit, Troy didn't look for the trainer's eyes, but for the center's eyes to check if the next snap was ready. When his body was more fatigued than usual, he didn't ask for rest, but adjusted his breathing to keep his voice steady. Teammates trusted him because he never gave them reason to doubt, and for that very reason, no one asked what he was enduring, because in the culture they all shared, the strongest didn't need to be checked on. Troy's silence was read as toughness, his endurance read as commitment, and the blanks in his eyes after games were overlooked as the inevitable result of a hard day's work. The tragedy lay in the fact that the better he led, the less he was allowed to show, the more trusted he was, the more he had to isolate himself from the need for comfort. In meetings he analyzed film with cold focus, pointing out his own mistakes before anyone else's, because he understood that leadership burden began with self-accountability. Off the field he maintained the familiar calm demeanor, because he knew any sign of instability from him could spread like a virus. Gradually, Troy's presence became the glue holding the team together, but also the wall separating him from real conversations about pain. No one thought to ask if he was okay, because they were used to him always being okay, and Troy, forged from childhood, didn't know how to speak up even when he wanted to. The one carrying the heaviest load is always the one least asked about. That rule operated quietly, every game week, every flight home after a game, every night when Troy sat alone with familiar headaches that had no language to describe them. His leadership was celebrated in the papers, referenced in the locker room as the gold standard, but its price had no place in post-game summaries. Troy kept doing what he knew best, showing up, controlling, enduring, and each time he carried another unseen piece of pressure. At some point, leadership stopped being a choice and became a state of existence, and when it merged with identity, questioning personal limits became nearly impossible. Under the stadium lights, Troy Aikman was the one keeping rhythm for the whole team. In the shadows backstage, he was the one keeping rhythm for himself, slowly, carefully, so no one noticed the widening cracks. And it was there in the space between acclaim and loneliness that the tragedy of the leader was completed. He had fulfilled the role so perfectly that there was no room left for the human being behind the performance, carrying the weight of collective faith with nowhere to set it down, continuing to walk forward because everyone expected it. Even though inside he was so exhausted, he didn't know who to ask. The 3 Super Bowl championships came to Troy Aikman, not as moments of redemption, but as a series of peaks, where the price paid increased with every step forward, where glory didn't heal but only covered the deepening cracks in his body and memory. When the Dallas Cowboys dynasty took shape and exploded in the early 1990s, history saw a complete team, a smoothly operating winning machine. But Troy, standing at the center of that machine, understood that the smoothness was lubricated by his own endurance. Every season advancing deep into the playoffs was another stretch where the body no longer had real time to recover. Every Super Bowl was an evening where adrenaline replaced rest and willpower replaced any sense of safety. Troy lifted the trophy in a state that outsiders could hardly recognize, a smile bright enough for the cameras, a stance solid enough for the ceremony, but inside was a body that had gone through too many collisions to be called intact. The dense hits of an entire season didn't vanish just because the trophy was handed over. They stayed settling in the brain like fine dust accumulating, not loud but persistent. The first victory opened the door to expectation, the second victory reinforced the belief that the sacrifice was worth it, and the third victory locked in the dangerous loop: if he kept enduring, glory would keep coming. But every time glory arrived, Troy realized something no one wanted to say in the moment of celebration. The feeling of emptiness appeared faster, the memory gaps lasted longer, and piecing together the game afterward became harder. There were details from those big games that he could only recall through film, moments that should have been etched deeply in his mind, but faded like photos left too long in the sun. Instead of stopping, Troy chose to continue because the dynasty didn't wait, and the leader wasn't allowed to ask how much longer he could hold on. In that way, glory became the perfect cover. It obscured questions about health, turned exhaustion into an acceptable side effect, and made any warning sound out of place amid the cheers. During the victory parades, when tens of thousands of fans poured into the streets, Troy saw the collective joy and understood that his responsibility was to keep that joy uninterrupted, while the lingering headaches, the unusually fatigued evenings, the disorienting moments after hits were neatly tucked into a separate compartment, where they had no right to interfere with the winning story. The peak of his career, therefore, was not a time for rest, but the most dangerous phase, the greatest pressure, the highest intensity, and the lowest tolerance for any sign of faltering. Troy didn't lift the trophy with the feeling that he had completed a journey. He lifted it with the awareness that tomorrow would start a new loop, where the body had to pay more to keep the icon standing. Each victory eroded his memory a little more, not enough to create shock, but enough to change how he perceived time and himself. The post-Super Bowl press conferences talked about strategy, teammates, legacy. No one asked about the moments Troy had to sit quietly after the game waiting for his mind to return to normal. Glory didn't heal brain injuries, it only created reasons to ignore them, turning them into the hidden cost of success. When the Cowboys dynasty is remembered as one of the NFL's most glorious eras, Troy understood that the public story would always be the story of victory, while his private story, the story of long nights piecing together memories, of fatigue disproportionate to his age, of silence maintained to protect the leadership image, would never appear in the highlight reels. The 3 Super Bowls became an indelible mark, but also 3 milestones where the price escalated exponentially. At each milestone, Troy reminded himself that enduring a little more was reasonable, because history was being written, and history, as he gradually realized, rarely notes what it has taken away. When the confetti fell and the lights gradually dimmed, Troy left the field with the title in hand and the consequences in his head, consequences that didn't appear immediately, didn't demand instant attention, but patiently waited in the shadows. That peak, therefore, was the greatest price. It locked in the choice, turned stopping into something nearly impossible, and forced Troy to keep standing firm, not just for the team or the fans, but because the winning story had been told too perfectly to allow any pause to acknowledge injury. Glory had done its job covering up, while Troy's body and memory quietly recorded every debt, to carry them as an inseparable part of a legend built on consecutive victories. After the stadium lights faded and the helmet came off, Troy Aikman stepped into the space where the central tragedy of his life took its clearest shape. A space without cheers, without a scoreboard, with only prolonged disorientation and a fatigue that no title could soothe. On the field, he was the legend, the one who set the rhythm, the one whose mere presence behind the center was enough to make the whole team believe order still held. But the moment the locker room door closed, Troy became a different person, slower, heavier, groping through each moment to piece together what had just happened. There were games where he couldn't fully remember every drive, situations that should have been stamped deeply in memory, but slipped away like water through fingers, leaving gaps hard to name. The shift happened so quietly that no one around noticed, because Troy had learned to hide every sign of weakness behind familiar composure. He changed clothes, answered interviews in an even voice, talked about strategy and teammates, as if his mind were completely clear, then left the field with the walk of someone who had completed the task. But inside, he carried the feeling of having just stepped out of a room where the lights had been suddenly turned off, needing time for his eyes to adjust to the dark. On those post-game evenings, as adrenaline faded, Troy faced fatigue disproportionate to his age, lingering headaches, an inexplicable emptiness, and he chose to keep it all private, because in the world that had celebrated him as the icon of stability, admitting those gaps meant questioning the very legend itself. Living as 2 people in one body became the normal state, one Troy on the field, precise and decisive, and one Troy off the field, withdrawn, trying to conserve energy to keep appearing as the version everyone expected. He didn't share with teammates, because they needed him strong, didn't share with the media, because they needed the winning story, and didn't know who else to share with, because he had long been taught that crying for help wasn't in a leader's vocabulary. The warning signs, fleeting absent-mindedness, accumulated fatigue, moments of having to pause to reorient himself, were handled by Troy like minor glitches in the system, to be patched quickly, so they didn't affect overall performance. He created new habits, private routines to control life off the field, just like he controlled the huddle, hoping surface order would compensate for inner chaos. But that order only covered, didn't resolve. The better he got at hiding, the more trapped he became in his own role, and the more celebrated as a legend, the harder it became to escape the expectation of always being fine. Those around him saw the composure, and thought it was peace. They didn't see the mornings Troy woke up feeling exhausted, even without practice, didn't see the evenings he had to sit quietly, waiting for his mind to stabilize. The tragedy wasn't in a public collapse, but in the prolonged state of fragmentation over the years, where Troy was both the one leading history and the one quietly enduring the consequences of leading it. He hid every sign of weakness, not out of pride, but out of responsibility, not because he didn't hurt, but because hurt wasn't allowed to appear in the collective story, and so the double life became the only way to exist, one public life shaped by victory and stability, and one private life where he had to deal alone with consequences no one asked about. Every time he stepped onto the field, Troy put on the legend's jersey again, locking doubts and fatigue behind. Every time he left the field, he took it off, facing his real self in silence. That split didn't cause immediate wounds, but it gradually eroded the sense of wholeness, making Troy increasingly accustomed to living in two different rhythms, one for the world, one for himself. At the center of this tragedy, there was no specific villain, only a man who had performed his role too well, to the point that there was no room left to admit that the price of greatness is sometimes the ability to live fully in a single body. When leaving the field and stepping into the family space, Troy Aikman faced a completely different game. A game with no playbook, no huddle time, and no scoreboard to tell him whether he was winning or losing. Troy's marriage, from the outside, didn't carry the look of the typical tragedy seen in the world of professional sports. No scandal, no noise, no sensational headlines or images of public collapse. Everything happened quietly, in line with the way Troy had lived his whole life, silent, disciplined, and avoiding disruption. But that very quietness hid a prolonged absence, emotional presence. Troy could be in the same room, under the same roof, at the same meal, but his mind often still operated like a quarterback reading the game, calculating the next move, preparing for the worst-case scenario. In his world, preparation was the way to show responsibility, but in family life, preparation couldn't replace being present, listening, and sharing. Troy was excellent at leading a team because he understood roles, understood pressure, understood how to maintain order when everything was chaotic. But in marriage, where no one assigned him a clear role or specific rules, he fell out of rhythm. He didn't know when to speak, when to stay silent, and when uncertain he chose what was most familiar, staying silent and continuing to fulfill outward duties. That absence wasn't intentional neglect, but the result of a life trained to prioritize mission over emotion. For many years, Troy brought home the same person the field needed, controlled, guarded, unexpressive, but his family needed a different person, someone willing to stay in conversations without solutions, in fragile moments that couldn't be fixed by effort. As pressure from his career, from the concussions, from the pain-induced silence loop accumulated, Troy withdrew further, relied more on the structure of work to stay balanced, and unintentionally let the distance in the family grow. There were no explosive arguments to mark the fracture, only prolonged fatigue, quiet meals, evenings where each person stayed in their own world. The family broke apart, not because of a major event, but because of the lack of small moments of presence, moments that Troy, with all his good intentions and responsibility, didn't know how to create. He was used to leading through decisions, but not used to staying when no decision needed to be made, used to taking responsibility for outcomes, but not used to admitting that some relationships couldn't be fixed by trying harder. When the marriage came to an end, there was no public blame, no harsh accusations, only the quiet sense of failure from a man who realized the skills that kept him standing before tens of thousands of spectators weren't enough to hold a home together. Troy didn't talk much about this period, because private failure had no place in the legendary story the public knew, and perhaps also because he didn't know how to express it properly, having been taught his whole life to solve problems through action, rather than words. The tragedy of Troy and his family lay not in a lack of responsibility, but in a lack of language for emotion, not in a lack of effort, but in a lack of presence at the right moments. When the family dissolved in silence, Troy carried another wound, not a wound of the body, but a wound of realization that there are games that cannot be won through willpower or discipline. He continued to appear in public with his familiar calm demeanor, continued to fulfill his role on television and at events, but inside was a new emptiness, a void that couldn't be filled with achievements. The family game ended not with a final whistle, but with the quiet acceptance that there were limits he hadn't recognized in time. And in that silence, Troy Aikman faced a truth harder to swallow than any hit on the field. He could lead a team to the heights of history, but didn't know how to stay fully present when there was no strategy left to cling to, ultimately losing something that shouldn't have had to be traded away. When the decision to retire came to Troy Aikman at age 34, it didn't feel like a carefully prepared farewell, but like the moment his body finally refused to obey orders after years of being forced to stay silent. Troy didn't leave the field amid boos or a public decline in performance. He left while still respected, still capable enough to continue if judged only by numbers and titles. But behind that surface picture was an unnegotiable reality. His brain had endured too much, and every next time on the field was no longer a question of win or lose, but a question of how much of himself would still be left. Retirement, therefore, didn't bring relief. It brought the feeling of a silent collapse, where a man who had lived his whole life by discipline was forced to admit there were limits that couldn't be overcome by willpower. Troy stepped off the field with a fear he had never learned to face, the fear of losing memory, the fear of waking up one day and no longer recognizing the moments that had made his life, the fear of a future no longer secured by schedule, strategy, and familiar role. When football disappeared from his daily rhythm, Troy lost his last refuge, the place he had used to avoid inner questions for so many years. No more field to focus on, no more huddle to control, no more whistle to mark start and end. He had to confront a nameless void. That void wasn't loud, wasn't intense, but it stretched on and felt uncomfortable, like an empty room with no idea what to put inside. In the early days after retirement, Troy still kept a player's habits, waking early, working out, watching film, but gradually he realized those habits no longer had a clear purpose, and purpose had once been what kept him standing. No next game to prepare for, no opponent to study, no collective pressure to carry, and no justifiable reason to keep ignoring signals from body and mind. The fear of memory loss wasn't something Troy voiced to others. It existed as an undercurrent, present in the way he became more cautious with headaches, in the way he started noticing absent-minded moments he would have brushed off before. The future for the first time appeared without a ready script, without a playbook to follow. For someone accustomed to the tight structure of the NFL, that sudden freedom wasn't a gift, but the greatest challenge. Troy didn't collapse in public, didn't fall into loud crisis. His collapse happened inside, in mornings not knowing what to prepare for, in long evenings where he realized he had spent his life learning how to endure, not learning how to live when there was no more enduring to do. Retirement forced Troy to face questions the field had once helped him postpone. If he was no longer a quarterback, who was he? If there was no collective pressure, what did he rely on to define his worth? And if the brain injuries left lasting marks, how would he live with them? The body had refused to obey, but the mind hadn't yet adapted to no longer needing to give orders. Troy stood between two states, no longer a professional athlete, but not yet knowing how to become a fully normal person. The prolonged silence after retirement wasn't a sign of peace, but the time he learned to accept that he couldn't keep running from himself through work. Every football memory, once a source of pride, now came with a question about the price paid. Every praise for his illustrious career reminded him what those years had taken away, something not easy to name. Troy had no map for this phase, because his entire previous life had been guided by clear goals and specific expectations. Retirement, therefore, wasn't the end of a chapter, but the opening of an empty space, where he had to relearn the most basic things: how to be still with himself, how to accept vulnerability, and how to face the future without a helmet to shield him. In that silent collapse, Troy Aikman didn't lose fame or the world's respect, but he lost the structure that had once kept him standing, forced to begin another battle, a battle with no audience, no cheers, and no clear victory, just to find the balance he had never learned to build at the peak. After leaving the field, Troy Aikman didn't step straight into a brilliant new life, as many imagine for retired legends, but slid into a state of provisional existence, where television became a way to survive rather than a form of salvation. Fox, and later ESPN, opened up a familiar space for Troy in a different way. Still football, still Sundays, still big games, but without the collisions, without the helmet, without the requirement to sacrifice his body to fulfill the role. The broadcasting job allowed him to retain the structure he needed to avoid falling completely into the void. A clear schedule, specific tasks, and a position where knowledge and experience were respected. Analysis replaced hits, reason replaced survival reflexes. That was a logical transition for someone who had spent his whole life controlling chaos. On television, Troy appeared with his familiar calm demeanor, talking about strategy, reading the game in a steady, low voice, not seeking emotional highs, not trying to draw attention. Viewers saw a former quarterback who had successfully transitioned, a model for a neat and safe post-NFL life. But beneath that professional shell, the silence remained intact, only changing form. With no field left to hide on, Troy used the analysis work as a way to continue keeping distance from inner questions. He spoke about football with the precision of someone who had been there, but avoided talking about what football had taken away. The double life didn't disappear when he hung up his cleats. It simply shifted from two physical worlds to two mental states. One Troy on air, confident, articulate, in control, and one Troy off camera, still carrying accumulated fatigue, long silences where he had to self-regulate his rhythm so his body and memory wouldn't rebel. Television didn't heal the brain injuries, nor did it resolve the fear of the future. It only helped Troy maintain a sense of usefulness, helped him avoid directly confronting the question of who he would be if football were gone in any form. Every broadcast was a familiar ritual, where he knew exactly what to say and when to stop, and that very clarity brought a sense of safety that private life still lacked. But that safety came with the familiar price, continuing to suppress emotion, continuing to stay silent, continuing to live in the expected role. Troy didn't talk about the evenings after going on air, when his mind was still spinning from the sounds and lights, when his body was tired in ways no one saw. He didn't talk about the times he had to remind himself that he no longer had to take the field, no longer had to prove anything. In the media world, his composure was seen as a professional virtue. In his inner world, it was still a defense mechanism. The transition from player to broadcaster helped Troy avoid physical hits, but it didn't erase the deeply ingrained habit of silent endurance. The double life now was no longer the contrast between on-field and off-field, but the contrast between a carefully curated public image and a private life, where he continued to grope for balance. Television brought income, fame, and continuity, but it didn't bring answers to the emptiness that retirement had exposed. Troy still chose to work hard, still prepared meticulously for each show, still held the highest standards for his role, because working was the way he knew to survive. But in that survival, he gradually realized that not every battle can be won with discipline and knowledge. Fox and ESPN weren't the final destination, but a bridge that kept him from falling into the abyss of emptiness, but also didn't take him to the other shore of healing. There Troy Aikman continued to live in the familiar divided state, close enough to football to not lose direction, far enough to avoid collisions and silent enough to maintain the image of a man who was fine. But it was precisely in that surface stability that the tragedy quietly persisted, reminding him that some wounds don't need blood to bleed, some pain doesn't need a field to be triggered, and some double lives don't end just because someone changed professions. At a point when silence was no longer a shield, Troy Aikman chose to speak out, not to judge the past, not to reclaim what was lost, but to acknowledge the price that an entire generation had quietly paid. The truth came late, as realizations about concussions often do, not with a bang, but with small pieces gradually coming into view over the years. Troy spoke about concussions in his familiar calm voice, without dramatizing his experience, without seeking pity. He didn't blame teammates for the hits, didn't fault coaches for letting him stay in games, and didn't build an image of himself as a victim. He simply said one simple, heavier than any accusation sentence: "We weren't protected." That statement wasn't aimed at any individual, but at an entire structure that had treated endurance as the standard, that had measured toughness by continuing to play as long as you could stand. Troy acknowledged that in his era, knowledge about concussions was rudimentary, protection protocols were thin, and the culture of winning had pushed every warning to secondary status. His continuing to play after heavy hits wasn't heroic action, but the result of a system that encouraged silence. When Troy spoke, he didn't try to rewrite history to make himself right. He only placed history in a more honest light, where greatness didn't obscure the shortcomings. He admitted that if there had been better choices, fuller information, perhaps many decisions would have been different, not to salvage achievements, but to preserve the human being. That belated truth didn't bring immediate relief. It brought responsibility. The responsibility to speak so that those who came after wouldn't have to learn by paying the price he had paid. Troy didn't stand on a moral pedestal, didn't call for boycotts or judgments. He recounted with the calm of someone who had accepted that the past couldn't be changed, but the future could be better protected. In his choice of words, there was the restraint of a leader accustomed to pressure, and the straightforwardness of someone finally allowing himself to name the pain correctly. He emphasized that what he and his teammates went through wasn't the fault of individuals, but the consequence of an era where victory was prioritized over long-term health. Admitting we weren't protected wasn't meant to diminish the achievements, it was meant to place them in the proper context, so glory no longer stood detached from its price. Troy understood that speaking out might shake familiar stories, but silence would let the loop continue. The truth, even if late, still needed to be spoken to pave the way for real changes, from stricter medical protocols to empowering players to stop when needed. In his words, there was no bitterness, only the clear-eyed sadness of someone looking back and realizing that much pain had been legitimized in the name of tradition. He didn't deny pride in his career, he only refused to let that pride obscure responsibility toward human beings. This acknowledgement was also an inner shift for the first time. Troy allowed himself to question sacrifices that had been taken for granted, not to regret, but to understand. To understand that strength lies not only in enduring, but also in protecting. That leadership is not only leading in victory, but also speaking up when the system needs fixing. When Troy spoke about concussions, he spoke slowly, clearly, as if each word needed to be placed down carefully so as not to hurt anyone further. He knew his story represented many who had no voice, those who had left the field in silence, and it was that very calm that gave his words weight. No need for anger to persuade, just the truth acknowledged. The belated truth didn't erase the memory gaps, didn't make the lingering fatigue disappear, but it gave new meaning to what had been endured. Troy Aikman wasn't seeking forgiveness, nor did he need praise. He chose honesty as a way to complete the circle of his life, from silent endurance to responsible speaking out. And in that moment, his greatness expanded, not just the accurate throws or the silver trophies, but the courage to admit that every victory has a price, and the duty of the previous generation is to speak so the next generation is better protected. Entering old age. Troy Aikman doesn't seek a dazzling final chapter, nor does he try to attach an easy, optimistic message to his life. His life slows down in an unshowy way, as if every movement is carefully weighed so as not to stir up what the body has lost and can never regain. Troy avoids noise, avoids the whirlwinds of public opinion, avoids even the temptation to recount the past with excessive pride. He understands that no miracle waits at the end. What has happened to his brain and body cannot be reversed by willpower or fame alone. Continuing to live, for Troy, doesn't mean being healed. It is the clear-eyed acceptance that some wounds will stay, and the remaining task is to learn how to live with them without letting them swallow what's left of the person. His days are arranged more simply, lighter schedules, longer rests, slow walks, quiet meals. He no longer chases the frantic pace of television if it makes his body react. He no longer tries to prove endurance by forcing himself to appear everywhere. Silence now is no longer a defense mechanism to hide weakness, but a necessary space to maintain balance. Troy learns to listen to the small signals, fatigue, stress, absent-mindedness, and considers stopping at the right time a quiet victory. He doesn't try to compensate with loud projects, doesn't pursue busyness as a form of escape, because he has understood that busyness once helped him survive, but it didn't help him live fully. Troy's old age has no grand declarations. It is built from small patient choices, where each day passing without incident is something to be cherished. He accepts that some memories will not return fully, that some mornings the mind is not as sharp as before, that energy is no longer abundant enough to carry others' expectations. That acceptance doesn't come from giving up, but from a deep understanding of limits, an understanding paid for with an entire career. Troy doesn't resent the past, doesn't regret in a way that exhausts himself. He places it in its proper place, a part that has passed, needing neither embellishment nor denial. The tragic echo of his life doesn't show through tears or complaints, but through a slow, careful rhythm of living, where every decision prioritizes safety and peace over glory. He keeps distance from noisy debates about legacy, because legacy for him now is simply being able to wake up each day and recognize that he is still himself. Not seeking miracles also means not placing hope in easy promises. Troy believes in small and realistic things: enough sleep, moderate exercise, genuine connection with those close to him. In quiet moments, he allows himself to remember the peak years without denying the price. He allows pride and sadness to coexist, without needing to exclude each other. Troy Aikman's old age is proof of a hard-to-hear truth. Not every great journey ends in healing. Some journeys end in acceptance. And in that acceptance, there is still dignity, still strength, still the quiet beauty of a man who has weathered storms, and no longer needs to win any more battles. He continues to live, not to make up for anything, but to preserve, not to assert, but to protect. The tragic echo therefore is not an endless sad note, but a stable low hum, so the rest of life isn't swept away. Troy understands that being healed isn't always a feasible goal. Sometimes continuing to live honestly, slowly and responsibly toward one's own body is the final form of courage. Stepping out of that final phase of life, Troy Aikman has no additional victories to recount, nor does he seek a belated redemptive moment to close the story. No miracle appears at the end, no full revival of body or memory, no compensatory reward for what was lost. What remains is a man who did everything according to the highest standards that society and sports once set, and therefore had to pay the price with himself. Troy didn't collapse in the way the world typically recognizes tragedy. He didn't fall before the cameras, didn't disintegrate in scandal, wasn't turned away by history. His tragedy lies elsewhere, in the outward completeness that covered the inner fragments, in standing so firm that no one thought he needed support. Throughout his career, Troy embodied discipline, control, a leader who didn't yell, didn't show off, just quietly carried the heaviest part. And that very quietness followed him to the very end, where glory could no longer heal, only cover. People remember Troy through the trophies, the big games, the sharp analyses on television. Few remember that behind each of those moments was a man who learned never to allow himself to fully feel the pain. He lived by a logic that was never wrong: work hard, take responsibility, don't complain, don't blame. But human life doesn't operate like a tactical system. Some injuries don't disappear just because we don't name them. When the career closed, when the cheers died down, Troy didn't try to rewrite the past to comfort himself. He accepted it with a heartbreaking calm. No final victory to lift the spirit, no promise that every sacrifice would eventually be repaid. Only the stark truth that years of silence left a longer-lasting mark than any moment of glory. Troy Aikman paid enough not because he was wrong, but because he was too right, right to the point of leaving no room for weakness to speak. In a culture that worships strength, he became an icon. In his personal life, he became the one who had to carry the consequences of that very icon alone. The honor given to Troy, therefore, lies not in adding more shine, but in daring to look straight at the price paid without complaint. He doesn't ask for pity, doesn't demand belated sympathy. He simply leaves a heavy lesson for anyone willing to listen. That lesson doesn't say don't be strong, but reminds that strength shouldn't be built on denying emotion. Some men don't break not because they are strong. They don't break because they never allowed themselves to feel the pain, until it stayed forever. The story of Troy Aikman leaves a smoldering sadness, not explosive, not dramatic, but heavy in exactly the way he lived. It's poignant not because he failed, but because he did everything right and still had to pay. From the early NFL years, when Troy stepped into a crumbling Dallas Cowboys as the #1 pick, he wasn't allowed to slow down or make mistakes. That pressure led him into the pain, endures silence loop, where every hit, every concussion was legitimized by the culture of, if you can still stand, you have to go back out there. The 3 Super Bowl championships didn't bring healing, but only covered accumulating injuries, to the point that some games he could only recall through film. The greatest tragedy wasn't on the field, but in private life, a marriage without scandal but dissolving in silence due to a lack of emotional presence, because Troy was excellent at leading teams, but didn't know how to stay when there was no playbook left. When he retired at age 34, he faced the fear of memory loss and the emptiness with no field left to hide in. Television became a way to exist, not salvation. The silence remained, only changing form. When Troy finally spoke about concussions, he didn't resent, didn't blame, just acknowledged we weren't protected. A belated but necessary truth. The lesson for Americans lies here: strength isn't just enduring. Any system that glorifies silence at all costs leaves human debts. Troy's story reminds us that success shouldn't be traded for denying emotion, that asking for help doesn't make us weaker, and that protecting people must come before protecting records. Honoring Troy Aikman isn't with more shine, but with understanding the price he paid, so an entire sport could learn to change. Thank you for staying until the end of the story about the quiet price behind the glory and resilience of Troy Aikman. If you value stories this real, please subscribe to the channel to keep joining us. See you in the next video, where we'll continue looking straight at America's icons, not to judge, only to understand.